Get out of this room right now. This place is only for VIPs.
As I walked into the Summit Wealthbank branch that morning, I didn't feel anxious. But the truth is, I was already prepared for what was about to happen, because I knew deep down that I wouldn't be treated like any ordinary client. Even though I was the CEO of Summit Enterprises, the company that owned nearly 80% of this very bank, I understood that in this space, someone like me, a woman, would never be seen as worthy unless I fit the traditional image of wealth and power. Dressed in simple attire, a pale blue cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and black loafers, I approached the front desk with a calm demeanor, requesting a $5 million withdrawal. Nothing extravagant. Nothing flashy. Just a woman walking into a bank, making a legitimate request. But I could sense the difference from the moment I stepped through the door. I knew they wouldn't treat me the same as a real client. The teller barely looked at me, nodding toward the private client lounge without asking any questions. I was directed to a room behind a glass partition, a subtle yet telling sign that I wasn't truly welcome. The moment I sat down at the desk, a strange sense of unease crept in. Then, as expected, she arrived, Lisa Newman, the branch manager. She walked over as though she were searching for a fire, her eyes scanning the room, but her focus was already on me. "We'll need proof of where your funds came from," she said, her tone flat, though her eyes were icy. The request was business as usual, but there was an edge in the way she spoke, an edge that signaled to me this wasn't about protocol. It was about something else, something personal. A small part of me felt a surge of frustration. I had been here before. When I was 23, my account had been frozen for unusual activity after I deposited my first commission from a real estate deal. When I was 26, a loan officer had called me high risk, even though I had over-delivered on collateral. And now, 2 decades and $8 billion later, it was happening again. This wasn't just a request for documents. It was another moment of being reduced to a stereotype, to a question of whether I belonged here. I calmly reached for my tablet, pulling up the necessary documents and sliding them across the desk. But before Lisa could even glance at them, a voice interrupted. "Don't clog up the line, sweetheart." Sevens, Edward Pierce, an arrogant 45-year-old investment banker, passed by with a dismissive flick of his wrist. His sneer was enough to make my stomach turn. He knocked my tablet off the desk, and it hit the floor with a soft thud, loud enough to be heard across the room. But the impact wasn't just physical. It was a message. I stared at him, but I didn't flinch. I refused to. He didn't even bother to look back. As the room fell into a moment of awkward silence, I could feel every gaze shift towards me. I wasn't invisible here. I wasn't just some woman making a scene. But I didn't care about being seen. I cared about proving that I wouldn't be dismissed this time. Across the room, Natalie Wells, a private banker, folded her arms and spoke up. "That amount of cash doesn't add up. You could have stolen it." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough to make heads turn. The words hit harder than I expected, and the room shifted into a state of quiet judgment. I blinked slowly, collecting myself. "Run my name," I said, calm but firm. Lisa shook her head. "You're not verified. This isn't a walk-in center." Sevens. And then, it happened. The moment when I knew they wouldn't stop until they humiliated me. I didn't flinch. Instead, I held my ground. The storm they were trying to stir up had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with what they believed about me, what they believed about women like me. And now, it was my turn to show them that their assumptions were wrong. The sense of doubt that hung in the air wasn't just about money. It was about who I was, how I dressed, and the space I was allowed to occupy. But I wouldn't let them win. Not this time. Not again. The moment Lisa Newman asked me for proof of funds, I could feel the weight of her suspicion bearing down on me. It wasn't just a routine inquiry. It was more than that. The sharpness in her tone, the coolness in her eyes, it all told me the same thing. She didn't see me as a legitimate client. She saw me as an outsider. The fact that I was sitting in the private client lounge of Summit Wealthbank didn't matter. My wealth, my status, none of it seemed to matter because I didn't fit the mold she expected. I had seen it before. Of course, those subtle looks of judgment, the way people in positions of power would size you up before deciding whether or not you belonged. At 23, I had been dismissed as a newbie when my account was flagged for unusual activity after depositing a real estate commission. At 26, the loan officer had told me I was high risk, even though I had over-delivered on collateral. But this time, this felt different. It felt personal. And it hurt more because this time, I was no longer a young woman just starting out. I was a successful businesswoman, a CEO, and yet, here I was, being treated like I had no right to even step foot in my own bank. As Lisa leaned over the desk, her body language was anything but welcoming. I could feel her scrutinizing every inch of me, from my simple sweater and jeans to my modest shoes. I wasn't wearing a designer label, I wasn't dripping in jewelry, and I wasn't flaunting my wealth in the way she expected. But I didn't need to. I had earned everything I had, and it wasn't anyone's business to question how I dressed or what I owned. And yet, here I was, being judged not just by my appearance, but by the color of my skin and the assumptions that came with it. When I slid the document across the desk to her, she barely glanced at it before turning to Edward Pierce, who walked by with his usual air of superiority. "Don't clog up the line, sweetheart," he sneered, knocking my tablet off the desk without a second thought. I watched it fall to the ground, and for a moment, everything slowed down. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, waiting for me to react. But I didn't. I refused to let them see how deeply their words and actions had cut me. I had been through this before, and I wasn't about to let them have the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I looked up at Edward, my expression calm, though inside, I was seething. I had been through too much to let this man, or any of them, take my dignity away. But the truth was, that's exactly what they were doing. Every word, every glance, every dismissive action chipped away at the person I had fought so hard to become. I wasn't just fighting for my money at that moment. I was fighting for my place in this world, for the right to exist in a space that I had earned, not just by my wealth, but by my hard work, my intelligence, my strength. And they were taking it away from me, piece by piece, as if none of it mattered. When Natalie Wells, standing in the corner, muttered that the amount of cash didn't add up, I could hear the disbelief in her voice. "You could have stolen it," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her words were designed to belittle me, to put me in my place. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reinforcing the idea that people like me, people who didn't fit the image of a proper client, didn't belong here. That somehow, my presence was a mistake, an anomaly in a world where wealth and privilege looked a certain way. I didn't react right away. I couldn't. I had to collect myself because if I let them see how deeply their words affected me, I would lose. I couldn't let them see that. Not after everything I had fought for. But it wasn't easy. My hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of the desk, and I could feel the anger rising within me. I wanted to scream at them, to let them know how wrong they were, how unfair this was. But I held it in, and instead, I said the only thing I could think of. Run my name. Sevens. It was simple, straightforward. Run my name, and you'll see who I am. You'll see who I've become, and you'll understand that I'm not here by mistake. I'm here because I belong here, just as much as anyone else. But Lisa shook her head, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. You're not verified, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It was as if the fact that I was sitting there, asking for what was rightfully mine, was a joke to her. And in that moment, the weight of her dismissal hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't just about the withdrawal or the paperwork. It was about being made to feel small, to feel invisible, to feel like I didn't matter, despite everything I had achieved. It was a reminder that, no matter how far I had come, there would always be people who would look at me, at us, and see nothing but the stereotypes they had been taught to believe. But I wasn't going to let them win. I wouldn't let them erase me, and I wouldn't let them erase the progress I had made. I wasn't here to beg for my rights. I was here to demand them. And no matter how hard they tried to break me down, I would not let their ignorance define me. The moment Edward Pierce walked past me, I could feel the disdain radiating off him. He didn't even try to hide it. He strutted by, his expensive suit pressed perfectly, his expensive cologne filling the air as he looked down at me with the kind of superiority that only comes from a lifetime of privilege. His dismissive sneer was enough to cut through the tension in the room. But it wasn't just the sneer. It was the way he treated me as if I was invisible, as if I didn't deserve to be there, as if I wasn't worthy of the same respect everyone else was getting. When he brushed past me, his wrist flicked in such a way that my tablet, which I had just slid across the desk to Lisa, was knocked off the table and landed on the floor with a soft thud. It wasn't just the action that stung. It was the message behind it. To him, I wasn't a legitimate client. I was an obstacle, something he had to move out of his way. The fact that I was asking for a $5 million withdrawal didn't even seem to faze him. In his eyes, I didn't belong there, and that, in itself, was enough for him to treat me with contempt. I could feel my blood boil as I watched him walk away, completely ignoring me, like I was nothing more than a nuisance. It was a feeling I knew all too well, a feeling I had experienced more times than I cared to admit. Being a woman in business, especially a woman of color, means constantly having to prove yourself. And here I was, once again, being treated like I didn't belong. The fact that Edward, with all his money and status, could get away with it without a second thought only added fuel to the fire. I wanted to say something, to stand up and confront him, to show him that I wasn't someone he could just dismiss. But instead, I sat there, quietly. I knew what would happen if I responded to him in the way I wanted to. I would be labeled the angry woman, the difficult one, the one who couldn't take a joke. So, I kept my mouth shut. But inside, my mind was raging. I wasn't going to let his ignorance and contempt go unchecked. I was better than that, and I would make sure that he knew it. Then came Natalie Wells, standing across the room, arms crossed, her face twisted in judgment. "That amount of cash doesn't add up," she said, her voice low but filled with enough venom to catch everyone's attention. "You could have stolen it." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. There it was again, the assumption that because of how I looked, how I dressed, and how I carried myself, I couldn't possibly be a legitimate client. The insinuation that I was trying to do something illegal, something dishonest. I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me, but I refused to let her see how much they affected me. I took a deep breath and looked at her, my gaze steady and unwavering. I had spent years building my empire, proving myself time and time again, and yet here I was, being treated like a criminal just because I didn't fit the image she had in her mind of who should walk through these doors. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not today. Not when I had worked so hard to be here. I had earned everything I had. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. Instead, I just let the words roll off my back. I couldn't let them see how deeply they had cut me. But inside, I was seething. I was angry, not just at Natalie or Edward, but at the system that allowed people like them to thrive while people like me were constantly made to feel like we weren't enough. As Lisa, still standing nearby, shook her head and muttered something about my lack of verification, I felt the final straw snap. I had been patient, calm, composed for so long, but now I was done. They had pushed me too far. Their contempt wasn't just about me being a client. It was about the fact that I wasn't what they expected. I wasn't playing their game, and that was something they couldn't tolerate. "Run my name," I said, my voice calm but firm. I wasn't going to beg for their validation. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to force them to face the truth, whether they liked it or not. I wasn't some imposter. I wasn't a criminal. I was Vanessa Clark, CEO of Summit Enterprises, and I owned this bank. But even as I spoke those words, I could see the contempt still in their eyes. It didn't matter that I had already proven myself time and time again. To them, I would never be enough. And the worst part? I knew this wouldn't be the last time I had to fight this fight. Because for people like Edward and Natalie, nothing would ever change. And they'd keep looking down on me, assuming I wasn't worthy, as long as I let them. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. This time, I would make them see me for who I really was. Not just the woman sitting in front of them, but the woman who had earned the right to be there, who had built something that they couldn't take away. I could feel the tension in the room building with every passing second, like an invisible storm gathering force. The words, the looks, the dismissals, they all weighed heavily on me, but none more so than Lisa's cold, disbelieving gaze. She had crossed the line from professional indifference to outright judgment, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Every second that ticked by, I felt my patience stretching thinner and thinner, the edge of my resolve growing sharper. I had been calm, collected, and dignified up until now, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was no longer about the withdrawal or the proof of funds. It was about something deeper, something personal. This wasn't just about a transaction. It was about how they saw me, how they thought they could treat me. And I wasn't going to let that slide any longer. I wasn't going to let them think they could push me around simply because they didn't like the way I looked, the way I dressed, or the way I chose to walk into their bank without a hint of extravagance. I had spent years building my empire, brick by brick, fighting tooth and nail to get where I was. I wasn't here because I had a rich father or a lucky break. I was here because of my hard work, my intelligence, my persistence. And yet, in this moment, all of that was irrelevant. To them, I was just another walk-in who didn't belong. When Lisa demanded to see my financial history, something in me snapped. She had already dismissed me, belittled me, and now she was trying to erase everything I had worked for, trying to strip away my dignity as if it was nothing. "Show me your financial history right now," she insisted, her voice dripping with contempt. "If you're legit, prove it. Open your account in front of everyone." Sevens. I had every right to feel angry, but instead, I felt something more powerful rising inside me, something that made the anger manageable, something that gave me control. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about standing my ground, about showing them that no matter what they thought, I would not be moved. Not now. Not ever. For a moment, I just stared at Lisa. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence between us was thick with the unspoken truth. I didn't owe her, or anyone in this room, any explanation. But she needed to hear it. They all needed to hear it. I wasn't going to bend to their will. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of breaking me down. "Why do you think you have the right to question me?" I finally asked, my voice calm but cutting. The words hit her like a slap. I could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with that same arrogance. She had no idea what she was dealing with. She thought I was just a woman in a sweater and jeans, but she had no idea who I really was. I stood up slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, I let the full weight of my presence fill the room. I wasn't just some woman asking for a transaction. I was the woman who owned the building she worked in. I was the one who had built everything she was so quick to dismiss. And I wasn't going to let her forget it. "Run my name," I said, my voice rising just enough to make sure everyone heard it. I wasn't asking anymore. I was telling them. They could keep questioning me, keep doubting me, but I wasn't backing down. I had worked too hard for too long to let them tear me apart with their ignorance. Lisa shook her head as if dismissing me once more, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. The walls she had built to hide behind were crumbling, slowly but surely. She had expected me to break, to apologize, to beg. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I had spent years in a world that tried to make me smaller, and I wasn't about to let her or anyone else do that to me again. There was a quiet murmur among the other clients in the room. They were watching now. They were listening. They could feel the shift in the air. I wasn't just standing up for myself anymore. I was standing up for everyone who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or looked down upon because of how they looked, how they dressed, or who they were. "Run my name," I repeated, more firmly this time. And for the first time, I saw a crack in Lisa's confidence. She was no longer the one in control. I wasn't the imposter in this room. I wasn't the one who had to prove anything. It was them. They were the ones who needed to prove they had a right to be here. The silence stretched between us, thick with the tension of what was about to happen next. But I didn't waver. I didn't back down. And that was when I knew I had won. Not because the transaction would go through. Not because I had proven anything to them. But because I had proven to myself that I could stand tall, no matter what they threw at me. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a battle for money or for recognition. It was a battle for my place in this world, for the right to exist without being constantly questioned. And as the silence stretched on, I knew I had won that battle, no matter how this moment ended. The air in that room was thick, and every breath I took felt like it was strangled by the rising tension. It wasn't just the fact that I was being questioned, doubted, dismissed. It was everything. The looks, the words, the way they treated me as if I wasn't supposed to be there, as if my presence itself was an offense to the system they had built. I had seen it before, but it never got easier. Each time, it felt like I was being pushed to the edge of something I couldn't control. But I wasn't going to break. Not now. Not here. Not today. When Lisa Newman demanded to see my financial history, it wasn't just a simple request. It was a challenge. She was testing me, trying to force me into a position where I would have to apologize, back down, or somehow make myself smaller. She didn't know me. She didn't understand what it took for me to be sitting here, in this room, facing her. She didn't know that her dismissive attitude, her refusal to see me as a legitimate client, was pushing me to the edge of my patience. But I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Not yet. I could feel my pulse quickening as her voice sliced through the air. "Show me your financial history," she said, her words clipped and demanding. "Open your account in front of everyone, or I'll have to call security." I could almost hear the smirk in her voice. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. My hands were trembling, but I kept them firmly clasped on the desk, using the pressure to ground myself. I had worked too damn hard to let her or anyone make me feel less than what I was. I had spent decades building something from nothing. I had fought for every inch of respect I earned, and I wasn't about to let a room full of strangers, with their judgment and their contempt, take that away from me. I took a slow, steadying breath and looked around the room. The eyes of the clients were on me, some curious, others indifferent, but all of them waiting for the storm to break. And I realized, right then, that the storm had already arrived. The question wasn't whether I was going to snap. It was whether they were going to learn the lesson that had taken me years to understand. That power isn't just in what you have. It's in what you can withstand. I looked at Lisa, keeping my expression as calm as I could manage. The contempt in her eyes was so clear, so raw, that it almost made my skin crawl. She didn't see me as someone who belonged here. She saw me as a challenge, as a problem to be solved. A woman who didn't fit the mold, who didn't conform to what she expected. She was determined to make me prove myself, to make me grovel for the right to even sit at the table. "Run my name," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cower. I wasn't going to give in to the pressure. I wanted them to see me for who I was, not for what they assumed me to be. But Lisa just shook her head, dismissing me like I was some nuisance she could ignore. "You're not verified," she said with a coldness that made my skin prickle. "This isn't a walk-in center." "Sevens." Her words cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't just about the verification. It was about the judgment. It was about the fact that I had walked in my simple clothes, asking for what was mine, and she couldn't fathom that someone like me could have the right to demand it. The more she dismissed me, the more the tension in the room thickened. And it wasn't just between me and Lisa. It was between all of us. Between those who saw me as a legitimate client and those who saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved. I stood up slowly, deliberately. My legs were shaking, but I kept my posture firm. I wasn't going to let them see how much this was affecting me. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I looked around at the faces in the room, some sympathetic, others passive, but all of them waiting for the storm to either pass or explode. And then it happened. Edward Pierce, the smug investment banker who had knocked my tablet to the ground earlier, spoke up. "Why should we trust someone like her with that kind of money?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "She's clearly not one of us." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the withdrawal. It was about the fact that, to him, I wasn't worthy. I wasn't good enough to sit at the table. But I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let his contempt take away what I had earned. I wasn't going to let him, or any of them, make me feel small. Not this time. I turned to face him, my voice now rising, stronger, sharper. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," I said, the words coming out with a power I hadn't realized I had until now. "I've worked harder than any of you, and I'm not going to let your narrow view of the world take that away from me." Sevens. The room went silent. Even Edward's smirk faltered, just for a moment, as he realized that he couldn't dismiss me any longer. He couldn't silence me with his condescension. And in that moment, I knew. This was the breaking point. The tension had reached its peak, and I wasn't about to let it break me. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. It wasn't just about the withdrawal anymore. It was about proving to them, to myself, that I had earned the right to be here. And I was going to make sure they knew it. For a while, I had been alone in that room, isolated by their judgment, surrounded by their doubt. Every word, every sneer, every look of suspicion felt like it was slowly chipping away at me. I wasn't just being questioned about my funds. I was being questioned about my worth, my right to be there. But somewhere, deep inside me, I held on to the belief that I had earned my place, that I wasn't some imposter, that I belonged. Still, the isolation felt suffocating, and I began to wonder if anyone would stand by me, if anyone would see through the cloud of prejudice that hung over me like a storm. I was about to give in to the pressure, to let their contempt define me, when I heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "This is foul." "Sevens." I turned toward the voice, and there, sitting to my left, was Maya Reed. She had been quiet up until that moment, a stranger in this strange room, but her words hit me like a lifeline thrown from a distance. Her expression was fierce, her eyes burning with a quiet but powerful rage. She wasn't just speaking for me, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been looked down upon, cast aside, dismissed. She wasn't going to let them silence her, and she wasn't going to let them silence me either. I felt a flicker of hope, a small spark that had almost been snuffed out, but now it was lighting up again. I didn't have to face this alone. Maya was standing up for me, and in that moment, I realized that the world wasn't completely against me. There were still people who saw the truth, people who understood. She stood up, her voice steady despite the anger that must have been boiling inside her. "She's not the problem." "You are," Maya said, pointing directly at Lisa and Natalie. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For the first time since I had walked into that room, the tension shifted. The weight of their words and actions was no longer just mine to carry. Maya was sharing it, shouldering some of that burden with me. I could see Lisa's face tighten in irritation, but there was no denying that Maya had made her point. I wasn't the only one who saw through the farce. Maya's support was like a shield, protecting me, giving me strength. The tension in the room started to dissipate, replaced by something else, something powerful. There was a shift in the atmosphere, as if the room itself was beginning to understand that things weren't as they seemed. But it didn't end there. To my surprise, Keith Morris, the tech entrepreneur who had been filming everything, lowered his phone. His eyes locked on mine, and he spoke, his voice filled with newfound conviction. "You're right," he said. "She's not filming." I was, but I stopped because she asked us to speak, not post. Maybe try listening for once. Sevens. Keith's words struck like a thunderclap, breaking through the silence that had fallen over the room. I had expected him to continue with the recording, to feed the spectacle of it all. But instead, he chose to be present in the moment, to speak up for the truth instead of hiding behind his phone. He, too, was standing with me, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in this fight for dignity and respect. I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders as I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. Maya and Keith weren't the only ones who had begun to speak up. The others, the clients in the room who had been silent until then, were beginning to shift in their seats. Some were nodding, some were muttering among themselves, but I could see it. Their hearts were changing. The room that had been filled with suspicion, disdain, and disbelief was slowly transforming into a place of support, a place where the truth was starting to take root. And then came the turning point. Maya spoke again, this time her voice trembling but clear. Enough. She stood taller, her hands shaking but her words strong. I'm tired of sitting here, watching people get torn down for no reason. Enough of this. She turned to Lisa and Natalie, her anger now palpable, her voice rising with the strength of someone who had been silenced for far too long. You don't get to decide who belongs here. You don't get to decide who deserves to be treated with respect. Sevens. Her words were like a rallying cry. I could feel the energy shift in the room, as if Maya's courage had unlocked something in everyone else. There was a quiet murmur of agreement, a subtle but powerful shift in the energy. I realized, in that moment, that Maya wasn't just speaking for me. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or discriminated against. She was standing up for what was right, for the truth that no one could take away. The room felt different now. The air was still charged with tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension that sought to break someone down. It was the kind of tension that marked a turning point, the kind that signaled the beginning of change. I wasn't the only one standing here anymore. Maya and Keith had my back, and I could feel the strength of their support surrounding me, lifting me up when I had been ready to crumble. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't alone in this fight. I had allies, people who saw the truth and were willing to speak out, even when it was hard. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to carry the weight of their judgment on my own. Because together, we could make it through. Together, we could change the room. The weight of their stares, their words, and their judgment had been suffocating. It was as if I was under siege, surrounded by people who didn't just doubt my legitimacy, but outright dismissed me because of who they thought I was, someone who didn't belong in the space I had built. But then, something incredible happened. A moment I didn't expect, but so desperately needed. I had been sitting there, holding my ground, trying to keep my composure while Lisa and the others did their best to tear me down. I had kept my voice steady, not letting their insults land, but it was getting harder with every passing second. I could feel my patience fraying, the internal battle between holding on to my calm and allowing the anger that had been simmering inside to break free. But then, out of the silence, Maya spoke. Her voice cut through the room like a blade, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. "This is wrong," she said, her voice rising, sharp and firm. "What you're doing to her, it's not right." Maya had been sitting beside me, quiet up until then, and yet in that moment, she became the voice I had been desperately waiting for. The voice of reason, of truth, of someone who could see beyond the surface. She didn't flinch when everyone turned their attention to her, didn't hesitate when Lisa shot her a cold glare. Maya stood up, her hands clenched at her sides, her body trembling with righteous anger, but her words were calm, calculated, and filled with undeniable power. "She's not the problem," Maya continued, her eyes now locked with Lisa and Natalie, who were both brimming with disdain. "You are..." "Sevens." It felt like a punch to the gut for them, and for me, it felt like a wave of relief had washed over me. Maya wasn't just defending me, she was speaking truth, something that had been absent from the room since I walked in. It was like the room itself had taken a collective breath. People were starting to shift in their seats, and I could see the doubt in the eyes of the clients around us. The seed of change had been planted. The moment that followed felt surreal. Maya's words had started something, and I realized I wasn't the only one who was fed up with the way I was being treated. I wasn't the only one who could see the injustice unfolding before us. I wasn't alone. And for the first time in what felt like hours, I wasn't fighting this battle on my own. Keith, who had been recording the entire ordeal, lowered his phone slowly, his gaze not on his screen, but on me. It was as if the decision had been made in that moment, like the weight of the situation finally clicked for him. He stepped forward, his posture shifting from passive to active, and said, "She's right. She's not filming. I was, but I stopped, because she asked us to speak, not post. We should listen, not just record." Sevens. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. I had been holding my breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up, to speak the words that I couldn't say without the fear of being labeled angry or difficult. But now, Maya and Keith had both spoken, and it felt like a wave of support had flooded in, pushing back the storm of negativity that had been swirling around me. I could feel the shift in the room. The eyes that had once been filled with judgment and skepticism were now beginning to soften, some faces even starting to look ashamed of the way they had let this go on for so long. I didn't feel alone anymore. The room was no longer just a place where I was being scrutinized and belittled. It was becoming a place where truth was beginning to be spoken, and where support and solidarity were emerging from the shadows. Maya's voice, though still trembling with emotion, was unyielding. "This is bigger than just one person," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "This is about how we treat each other, about the assumptions we make based on nothing more than our own biases." Her words were powerful, resonating in the silence that followed. "And if we continue to let this happen, then we're all complicit. But if we stand up, if we speak out, we can change this." Sevens. And that was when it hit me. Maya wasn't just standing up for me. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or made to feel small. She was speaking for every person who had ever been underestimated or prejudged based on how they looked, how they dressed, or what they represented in the eyes of those in power. Maya turned back to Lisa and Natalie, and her words cut through them like a blade. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. You don't get to decide who gets to walk through these doors." Sevens. I watched as Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her jaw tightening, but she couldn't find the words to rebut Maya's challenge. It was as if Maya's words had stolen the ground from under her. And in that moment, for the first time since I entered the room, I realized something powerful. Their power came from silence. Their power came from ignoring the truth, from allowing the biases in the room to go unchallenged. But Maya had broken that silence. She had broken that power. The room was changing. Slowly but surely, the narrative was shifting from one of exclusion and discrimination to one of inclusion and support. It wasn't just Maya who had spoken out for me. It was Keith, too. It was the clients in the room who were starting to see what was happening and questioning the injustice in front of them. And for the first time since I sat down in that room, I felt supported. I felt seen. And more than anything, I felt strong. The tension in the room was unbearable. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me with every second that passed. My chest tightened, and my breath became shallow as the words from Lisa, Edward, and Natalie echoed in my mind. They had stripped away my confidence, piece by piece, and now I was left standing there, vulnerable in front of everyone. I had always prided myself on my strength, my ability to hold my ground, but in that moment, I could feel myself faltering. "Go to a pawn shop," Edward's words rang out again, and for a moment, it felt like the floor beneath me had crumbled. I stared at the note that had been tossed at me, the words searing into my mind. The humiliation was almost too much to bear. I had spent years building something real, something substantial, and yet here I was, being treated like I was some sort of fraud. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, trying to push back the sting of tears that threatened to rise. I couldn't let them see me break. I couldn't show them how much their words were hurting me. I had fought too hard to be where I was, and yet here they were, taking it all away with their casual cruelty. But the fear wasn't just in their words. It was in the way they looked at me, the way they assumed I didn't belong here. It was the fear of being completely exposed, of being judged not for who I was, but for what they assumed me to be. They had already made their minds up. To them, I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't someone who had built an empire. I was just a woman in a simple sweater, someone who didn't fit their idea of what success should look like. And that terrified me. The silence in the room was oppressive, and I could feel the weight of all their eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to react. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing how much they had shaken me, but I couldn't deny the rising panic within me. My mind raced, the fear of what they might do next threatening to overwhelm me. They had already accused me of being a fraud. They had already threatened to call security. What else could they do? What if they really did have me arrested? The thought of being dragged out of the bank, humiliated in front of everyone, made my stomach turn. I tried to push the fear aside, to focus on what I needed to do next. I had to remain calm. I had to hold my ground. But the fear kept creeping back in, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. It was a fear that went beyond just this moment. It was the fear of being seen as less than what I had worked so hard to become. It was the fear of being reduced to nothing, of having all my achievements dismissed because of how I looked, because of who I was. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for my tablet, trying to steady myself. I opened it and pulled up the document, trying to focus on the words in front of me, but all I could think about was the way they were looking at me. I could almost hear their judgments, the whispers that had started in the corner of the room, the way their eyes flicked over me like I was nothing more than a spectacle. And then, just as I was about to speak, to demand that they treat me with the respect I deserved, I saw it. Maya's face. She was sitting just to my left, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line of frustration. She had been silent up until now, but in that moment, I saw the fire in her eyes, the quiet determination that mirrored my own. I realized, in that instant, that I wasn't alone. Maya had been watching, too, and something in her had snapped just as it had in me. For the first time, I didn't feel so afraid. I wasn't the only one who saw the injustice in this room. Maya was with me, and the realization hit me like a wave. The fear that had been consuming me started to recede, replaced by something else, something stronger. Maya stood up, and her voice cut through the silence. It was calm, measured, but there was no mistaking the anger behind it. "Enough," she said, and her words landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. "This isn't right. You can't treat people like this, not because of how they dress or who they are." Her gaze turned to Lisa, then to Natalie, and I could see the challenge in her eyes. "She's not the problem. You are." "Sevens." The room fell silent, and for the first time, I could breathe again. Maya's voice was like a lifeline thrown to me, pulling me back from the edge of fear and uncertainty. She wasn't just speaking up for me, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated like this, like they didn't belong, like they were invisible. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of their hatred alone. Maya was standing with me. Keith, too, had lowered his phone and stood up for what was right. I wasn't alone. I wasn't going to let them break me, not with Maya beside me, not with the strength of the truth backing me up. The fear, the vulnerability that had nearly overwhelmed me, was replaced by something much stronger. A resolve to fight for what was right, to stand tall in the face of their cruelty. In that moment, I knew that I would no longer be afraid. The truth would be heard, and I would be heard. For so long, I had fought quietly, letting my actions speak louder than any words ever could. I had worked tirelessly to prove my worth, to build something substantial from the ground up, only to face a room full of doubt, judgment, and contempt. It felt like an unending battle, like I was constantly fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged as someone who had earned her place. And yet, as I stood there, surrounded by people who thought they could push me around, all of my hard work, all of my accomplishments, seemed irrelevant to them. But something had changed. The moment Maya spoke up, the moment Keith put his phone down, the tide had shifted. It wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about taking back my dignity. I realized that, despite everything they threw at me, I wasn't alone. I wasn't fighting this battle by myself. Maya, Keith, and even the other clients in the room were with me, standing by me, refusing to let me be the scapegoat for their biases. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The fear that had gripped me, that had made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter, started to fade. It was replaced by something more powerful: confidence, strength, the knowledge that I wasn't the one in the wrong. I didn't need to justify myself to them, to prove that I belonged here. I had already done that with every move I made, with every challenge I overcame. And then, just when I thought the battle couldn't get any more intense, I found my voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was steady. It was calm. And in that steadiness, I felt the full weight of my power. "You called me a fraud," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the room. "You questioned my worth, my place in this bank. But you failed to see something. I built this place. I own this place." The silence that followed was deafening. The words I had spoken hung in the air, and for the first time since I had walked into that room, I could see their disbelief, their shock. They had underestimated me. They had thought they could diminish me, make me doubt myself. But I had turned the tables, and now they had no choice but to face the truth. And it wasn't just about the withdrawal anymore. It wasn't just about proving that I had the right to access my own money. It was about standing up for myself, for every person who had been dismissed or belittled simply because they didn't fit someone else's narrow view of what success should look like. It was about showing them that I would not be silenced, that I would not let them erase me. The room was still, almost unnervingly still. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an audience, watching, waiting, absorbing the reality that I was the one in control now. They had tried to tear me down with their words, with their accusations, but I was still standing. I was still here, and I wasn't going anywhere. "Run my name," I repeated, this time louder, with the full force of my conviction. "I am Vanessa Clark. I am the CEO of Summit Enterprises. I own this bank. And every second you've spent trying to make me feel less than, trying to make me feel small, it's been recorded, it's been witnessed. And now, it's time for you to answer for it." There was no deflection now. No more cold stares, no more dismissive comments. Lisa, Natalie, and Edward, who had spent the entire conversation trying to diminish me, stood frozen. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and they were left with nothing but the truth. But then came the final moment, the moment when I truly realized I had won. The moment when everything I had worked for, All the years of perseverance, of proving my worth, came together in one undeniable truth. The clients in the room began to clap. At first, it was tentative, uncertain, but then it grew louder, stronger, more assured. Maya stood beside me, her face glowing with pride, and for the first time, I saw the real power of solidarity. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us who had been overlooked, disregarded, made to feel like we didn't belong. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter, like their voice wasn't worth hearing. The applause was deafening now. It wasn't just polite applause. It was genuine. It was a recognition of the truth, of the fact that I had stood up, not just for myself, but for every person who had ever been silenced. It was the recognition that we had all witnessed something real, something transformative. And then, in the midst of the applause, I looked at Lisa, who stood there, her face pale, her posture slumped. For the first time, I saw her for what she truly was. Someone who had failed to recognize the strength in others. Someone who had let her own biases cloud her judgment. She had underestimated me, and now she was facing the consequences. I took a breath, steadying myself for the final moment. "This bank is no longer just yours," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "It's for everyone. It's for people like me, people who deserve to be heard, people who deserve respect. And if you can't see that, then you don't belong here." And with those words, I knew this wasn't just a moment of triumph. It was a moment of change. I had done more than win a small battle. I had exposed a system, a mindset, and I had begun to dismantle it. I had shown them that power wasn't about who you were or what you had. It was about standing in the truth, even when everything around you tried to make you doubt it. This was my victory, and it was just the beginning. I could feel it, the unmistakable pulse of determination running through me, as if every fiber of my being was telling me to hold my ground. I wasn't just fighting for a transaction anymore. I wasn't just sitting in a room full of people who thought they could dismiss me. I was fighting for my right to exist in a space that I had earned. I wasn't about to let them make me feel small, not after everything I had worked for, everything I had overcome. Their words, their accusations, had been nothing but a constant assault. Fraud, they'd called me. Imposter. They didn't see the woman who had spent years building an empire, who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of success. They didn't see the battles I had won, the decisions I had made, the sacrifices I had endured to be sitting in that room. All they saw was a woman they assumed didn't belong. But I wasn't going to let them control this narrative. I wasn't going to let them dictate my story. As the tension in the room grew thicker, I felt my resolve harden. Maya's voice had cut through the silence, her words a lifeline. Keith's support had given me the courage to keep going. But now it was time for me to take full control of this moment. I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to change their minds. No, this wasn't their story to tell. This was mine. With every accusation they threw at me, every sneer from Lisa, every judgmental word from Edward, I could feel my sense of self solidifying. I was done being passive. Done letting them push me into a corner. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to apologize. I was here because I had every right to be here. And no matter how hard they tried to tear me down, I would stand tall. "Enough," I said, and the word hit the air with such force that it felt like the room stopped breathing. My voice was steady, not shaking. No doubt. No hesitation. Just absolute conviction. The room fell silent, and for the first time since I had walked in, I felt like I was finally being heard. Not just as a client, not just as the person in front of them, but as someone who had earned the right to stand there, to claim space. "I don't owe you an explanation," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't owe you anything except for the truth. And the truth is, I built this place. I earned my right to be here. I don't need your approval to exist in a space I own. And you will not diminish me for the way I look or the way I dress." Sevens. With every word that left my lips, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. It was as if the invisible chains that had held me back, that had made me second-guess myself, were breaking apart. And I realized this was more than just a confrontation. This was a stand, a declaration. I wasn't here to play by their rules. I was here to change them. I looked around the room, seeing the faces of the clients who had been silently watching, witnessing everything. Some of them were nodding, some were looking at me with a newfound respect, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The power had started to move in my direction. They were starting to see me, starting to realize that I wasn't just some walk-in they could brush aside. I was the force in the room now. Turning my gaze back to Lisa, I locked eyes with her, refusing to back down. "You've spent this entire time trying to make me feel small, trying to make me feel like I don't belong here. But you're wrong. You've underestimated me, and that's going to cost you." "Sevens?" Her face twitched, the mask of confidence she had worn so easily beginning to crack. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't finished making my point. "This isn't just about me," I continued, my voice now carrying the weight of everything I had been holding inside. "This is about everyone who's ever been dismissed, who's ever been overlooked, simply because they don't fit your narrow view of what success should look like. This is about all the people who've been made to feel like they don't belong just because they dared to exist differently." Sevens. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. But in the middle of it, I stood firm. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't backing down. "I'm not here to beg," I said, my voice ringing out, clear and unwavering. "I'm here to take what is rightfully mine. I'm here to show you that I belong here. And I'm here to make sure that no one else will ever have to fight for their right to exist in a place they've earned." Sevens. I could feel the room shift, the energy changing. I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been overlooked and dismissed, for every person who had been made to feel less than. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a battle for money. This was a battle for dignity, for respect, for the truth. And I had already won, because the truth had been spoken, and it was undeniable. I wasn't leaving until they knew who I was, until they knew that I wouldn't back down. Because this was no longer just about getting my withdrawal. This was about showing them the power of standing firm, the power of never allowing anyone to strip you of your worth. And with that, I knew the course of everything had changed. I had made my stand, and now nothing would ever be the same.